Hi, folks. My name's Remy Shergill. I'm the Senior Sustainability Officer at Glen Eira City Council. Thank you for being here tonight. Tonight's webinar is on water and greening, and it's co-hosted by the City of Stonington and the City of Glen Eira. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this country. Tonight, I'm calling in from Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung country, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. The cities of Stonington and Glen Eira are based on the traditional lands in the Eastern Kulin Nation of both the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong Boonwurrung peoples. And I extend my respect to their elders, and also to any First Nations peoples who might be with us tonight. With me tonight as well is Vet Koopstra, Sustainable Environment Officer at the City of Stonington. So, without further ado, I will introduce our guest of honour, Charlotte Harrison. Charlotte is a qualified horticulturalist and avid home gardener with a particular interest in sustainable gardening practices. She and her partner are also keen home renovators and have given new life to 2 homes in Hawthorn. And when she's not renovating, Charlotte delivers the community workshop program at Sustainable Gardening Australia. Sustainable Gardening Australia is a non-profit organisation in Melbourne which aims to inspire and empower communities to garden sustainably. And we're very lucky to have her here today. So Charlotte, I'll pass over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Remy. And I'm really pleased to be here and presenting on behalf of Renew. Always been a big fan of Renew, a non-profit organisation working to transform Australian homes to be much more climate and energy resilient. And I know that the emphasis on tonight's webinar is really about renovating. And as Remy said, I'm a very keen renovator. So I've blurred the background because I'm in the one unrenovated room in my home. So I'll get straight into the presentation. I'm going to share my screen now. All good. So tonight we're going to be talking about water and greening, and it's really about both water and green water within your house, water use within the house, capturing water, and also water in the landscape. So we'll be talking about water at home as well as in the garden. And we'll cover the principles of water-sensitive urban design, which is really talking about how important it is to manage water within cities, and that includes on our own homes as well as what councils do in terms of infrastructure. Then we'll look at water in our house and in the garden. We'll spend a very short period of time talking about fire-wise gardening, which is probably not super relevant to us in suburban Melbourne, but if you have, a second home or something, we'll just talk briefly about some landscape principles that we can use for fire-wise gardening, and then list some resources at the end. So what is water-sensitive urban design? If you've put in a building application or planning application, you may have seen attached to it something called a WSUD design. And what it's looking at is really the amount of hard surface versus soft impermeable surfaces in your landscape, how much water rainfall is likely to fall on your landscape, and how that water is going to be diverted, stored, or treated before it goes into stormwater. And water-sensitive urban design has really become a pretty important feature and issue as we become a little bit more aware of the effects that built environments and cities have on our water use in our landscapes. So if you look at the image on the left there, it's a representation of a forested landscape, and you may sort of recognize this kind of a diagram from primary school where you had the water cycle, and it was all water being evaporated up off plants, and transpired through plants, evaporated from the soil, going up to form rain clouds, and then falling back on onto the plants and ground again, and then a portion of that water percolating through the soil down into the ground, into groundwater, or into our rivers and streams. And in that sort of scenario, about 85% of the water would either be evaporated from soil or transpiring from the leaves of plants and trees. And that transpiration is really important because it creates a more humid environment, and it also helps to cool the area. If you contrast that to the diagram on the right of your screen, the urban situation, that proportion of 85% being evaporated and 15% going into waterways is actually flipped. So there's only about 15% of the water that falls in an urban area is evaporated and transpired back into the atmosphere. The rest is generally diverted off hard surfaces and into stormwater drains. And this can have a big effect on pollution in our waterways, because obviously it's not only water going into stormwater drains, but that water takes a lot of pollutants and rubbish with it. It can also create localized flood risks. So if you think about even a moderate rain event is putting a lot of stormwater volume down into what are in Melbourne quite old drainage systems. And it's also obviously stopping our cities being quite so humid. So we're getting less humidity, a greater heat buildup from our buildings, and all of this is resulting in less base flow in our groundwater. So our cities are drier and hotter than they would otherwise be if we had, a more green environment with less hard surfaces. So when we're thinking about water-sensitive urban design on our properties, there are a few principles that we're thinking about. And the top one is really important. So slowing water down, soaking it up or storing it, and then let it sink in. So essentially what we're aiming to be is be a little bit selfish on our properties and keep the water within the boundaries of our properties for as long as we can before it might percolate down or go into very slowly into stormwater, rather than having, a rain event resulting in a huge rush of stormwater from everyone's properties all at the same time. So we're making the water work harder for us in our homes and in our gardens. Another principle of water-saving urban design is that gravity is our friend. And what that means is that we're not necessarily relying on really expensive bits of technology and pumps and things like that. If you're capturing rainwater off your roof, you can do that simply by using gravity and positioning your water tank in an area where the water goes straight into it, and then you don't necessarily need pumps and things to distribute that around your garden. The other thing is that water-saving urban design is really property specific. Every property is unique, and I hope tonight you can get some ideas for your property that would be suitable for you. The other thing I would say is that water-sensitive urban design is really suitable for retrofitting and renovation. It can apply to new buildings, but it's just as relevant to what you're doing when you're renovating. Or even if you're not renovating, you can apply some principles to an existing home. So this is just quickly another way of thinking about water flow in and out of your property. So the sources of water for your property are either rainwater or tap water. Within your patch, within your home and garden, you're using water, you might be reusing it, you can store it, and you can use it to support biodiversity. And then in terms of water going out of your property, it's either going to go in stormwater or sewerage, or evaporation or transpiration. And interestingly, when we're thinking about how we're going to manage water, the only thing that we can't influence in any way is rainfall. All of the other elements we can have some impact on to one extent or the other. So as we go through, you can have a think about which of those you might want to implement in your renovation. I guess the most important ones in terms of outflows would be to aim to reduce the amount of stormwater, the water that's going into stormwater, and increase evaporation and transpiration. So the other thing that's really good is to have a plan. So if as you start your renovation, or even if you're just in your existing home, you can think about how you're using mains water, what you're using your mains water for, how much of your water is going into stormwater, and whether it can be diverted or stored or used on your property. Whether grey water is appropriate for you, and we'll talk a little bit about that, more about that later. And also, if you're planning landscaping, how you can make your landscaping a little bit more water smart and less reliant on using a lot of water, but also thinking about which areas need irrigation and how to do that in a water smart way. So we'll look firstly inside your home. And this is a graphic from Sydney Water, and it's just talking about delving a little bit deeper into actually how you're using water in your home. And you can do this a number of ways. Probably the simplest is to take a period of time, say a week, and just record like how many times you use the dishwasher, how many times you're using your washing machine. You might want to time your showers. If you have teenagers, you may not want to time your showers because that might be a bit shameful how much time they spend in there. You can have a look at, how often you flush the toilet if you want to, or you can just estimate those things. But what you will get is, I guess, a percentage of where your water is actually being used. So in this example, half of the water in that household is being used in bathrooms, either in the showers, the baths, or flushing toilets. About a quarter of the water is being used outside in outdoor taps, and then another quarter is being used essentially in the laundry and kitchen. So that may be a useful thing just to start you thinking about how you use water, and even doing that exercise can sort of, I guess, make you question your habits and question whether there are small things that you could change that might alter those proportions a little bit. The other way you can do that water audit is not room by room, but the type of water by type of water. This is really important if you're thinking about grey water. So for example, you could use the water from the shower and the bath for grey water, but you wouldn't use the toilet flushing water for grey water. So you might split your water up into what we call like cleaner grey water and then black water. And black water would be something that has to go in the sewerage. That would usually be your toilets and also kitchen sinks and dishwashers. And I'd also say it would also include laundry water if you're cleaning nappies. So that's a good exercise to start with. You can then think about whether you want to include water efficient fixtures, either to retrofit what you already have, or to buy new appliances, and also taps, shower heads, and things like that. So the WELS rating is a rating out of 6 stars. And there is a website that I think Doug might put in the chat where you can go and look at the most efficient, water efficient appliances, and consider that when you're buying your appliances, for example, if you're doing a new kitchen or laundry. The other thing you can think of if you are doing a renovation and you're changing the layout and configuration of your house is where you put your hot water system. And the idea of this would be to put your water system near your wet areas, so that you're not running a lot of, you don't have to run the water a lot when you turn your hot water tap on. So if you have your kitchen on the other side of the house from your hot water system and you turn the hot water tap on, you have to wait quite a while for the hot water to come through, and you're wasting all of that cold water. So by clustering your wet areas together, what you're doing is saving both water and the energy and the heating costs for that water. The other thing you might look at is putting water tanks near where they'll be used. So near where your gutter outflows are is really good, but also, for example, if you have one area of your garden that needs a lot of water, like a veggie patch or something like that, if you can position your tank near where you're going to use it, that's a really good idea as well. So assuming you are going to harvest some grey water and some rainwater and look at storing that in a tank, you want to start with your roof. You're going to start at the top. So you want to look at your gutters and keep them as clean and debris free as possible. So you can do this by using gutter guards. So you can see the picture there has like a mesh that will stop large leaves and large pieces of debris going into your gutter. The other thing you can do is just maintain your gutters really well. But even if you do this, you will get some dust buildup on your roof and you'll get some sediments and things into your gutters. So the next thing you'd be looking at is to have a leaf diverter and a first flush device. So a first flush device will essentially take the first several litres of water or tens of litres of water in a rain event and direct them into stormwater. So that's the water that should be a little bit dirtier and containing sediments and things like that. So that gets flushed, and then the rest of the water from the rain event gets diverted into your rainwater tank. And it is much, much easier to have these things in place and make sure that water isn't going in there, because it's quite difficult if you do get a lot of debris in your tank to clean out tanks. So you want to make every effort possible to keep your tank really nice and clean. So that's a leaf diverter and a first flush device. You then might want to look at how big you want your water tanks to be. And Renew has a fantastic, like industry leading calculator on its website called Tankulator. And in Tankulator, you would put in some information about the area of your roof, where you're living and what your average rainfall is, how many people are in your house, and what you're going to use your water for. So you might be using it to flush toilets, you might be using it for your garden, and you can sort of say how big your garden is. And Tankulator will give you an estimate of the size of tank you need. One thing to consider is that you don't need to have all of your stored water in one tank. You can have several tanks and several different kinds of tanks, and that can actually be a really good thing. So if you do run into problems with one, or one, you springs a leak or something like that, then you sort of spread your risk. But it can also be a really good way to, I suppose, minimize the impact on your landscape design of your water tank. So having one enormous water tank above ground can be a pretty big feature in your garden and in your landscape. But for example, having 3 or 4 slimline tanks along the side of your house can be a much better option, because you can then have a usable space. You've put them somewhere a little bit out of sight. You don't need to design around them, and they don't become a focal point in your garden unless you want them to. So here are just a few different tank options and materials. So you can see there a slimline corrugated iron tank, PVC tank. The one on the bottom left is a water bladder, and these can sit under your house or really commonly under a deck. And they're good if you want to hide the water tank and you have some underfloor space. The ones on the right are much lower cost options. So I think the one on the top there is like a food grade container, the sort of one that they store olives in, and it's been sort of fitted as a little rainwater tank. And then the one on the bottom is a UBC, and again, you just want a food grade one. But I suppose it's just to show that you don't need to spend a fortune. There are some DIY tank options, and you can get plumbers to help you if you've got the tank and you've sort of worked out exactly like what you want in terms of design. Either you can get a plumber to help you install a DIY. The other thing, just before I talk quickly about design, garden design and tanks, is if you do invest in a tank, I would really, really encourage you to use the water from it. I used to consult in gardens, and you wouldn't believe the number of gardens I went into that had water tanks. And I'd say, oh, so, where's the hose fitting, or where do you attach is it attached to your irrigation? And people would say, oh no, we don't use that tank water, as though it was like way too precious to use. But if you think about it, if your objective is to stop so much water going to stormwater, if your tank is full all the time and it rains, all that's going to happen is that the rain that comes off your roof is going to be diverted through the overflow straight into stormwater. So if you have a tank, you're much better to use that water, even if the tank becomes dry, between rain events, and then let it have some capacity to fill it up again. And there was a guy I did my master's with who had the idea of the leaky tank. And he actually didn't have a leaky tank, but what he did was he just let his hose, which was attached to his rainwater tank, drip with a very small drip all the time. And the idea is that he was returning water to his landscape. And he used to just move the hose around every couple of days when he thought about it. But what it meant was that his tank always had capacity to fill up when it rained, and that he was keeping all of his rainwater that he was stored in the tank. He was just gradually distributing it around his garden. So if you do invest in a tank, and that, it can be an expensive thing if you're going to get a large volume, don't be afraid to use the water. It's there to use. And as I say, it actually is helpful to have a half empty tank that has the capacity to fill up when it's needed. So this is last slide in terms of rainwater tanks is really just to show you a few ideas for incorporating them into your landscape design, because as I said, they can be considered a little bit of an eyesore. But some options are, firstly, I guess, to put them along the side of your house, which is an area that you don't see very much. It's often an area that's difficult to grow plants in well. If you do have it out in a more open area, growing a climber over it, like I think that top one might be a passion fruit vine, just to cover over some of the surface area is a really good idea. Or you can see in that bottom courtyard design that they've used a slimline tank sort of as a backdrop, as almost a decorative feature in their courtyard landscape design. So next we're going to talk really quickly about grey water. And grey water is different from storing rainwater in a number of ways. So the first thing to understand is that you can't store grey water. It really needs to be put on from where it's used onto the garden straight away. And that's because there's always a little bit of a risk of pathogens within grey water. If you think about it, it's got, skin cells and a few other biological things happening. And so you aren't able to store grey water. It needs to be something that has a continuous sort of outlet to the garden. The other thing with grey water is that it may have a little bit more of a lifestyle impact on you than tank water, because you need to be conscious of using low phosphate and, if possible, low salt laundry powders and soaps and things like that, things that you put in your bath. So in terms of grey water, the sources we're looking at are, as I said, hand basin, your shower, bath water, and perhaps your laundry water. We're not looking at toilet water or water that's used to wash nappies, or even in most cases water that's been in the kitchen sink. That's considered, because it's got food waste on it, it's usually considered to be black water. A grey water system, you can retrofit them, or you can include them in your design. My recommendation would be to start that discussion with your builder really early in the process, and include both your builder and your plumber if you are looking at grey water, because I think they both need to be on board, and you need to have a plan early. Because in terms of baths and things, you need to have adequate fall from baths and shower trays to make sure that water can make it outside. And then once it gets out into the garden, as I said, it's put onto the garden regularly. So it would be either gravity fed or pumped into your garden essentially after you have a shower or bath. And it's usually channeled under mulch through pipes with holes in them. So you can see the middle photo there is just a perforated sort of ag pipe. The one on the right is a dripper pipe, but it's a dripper pipe with a larger diameter hole than you usually have under a normal irrigation system. And that's just to account for the fact that grey water irrigation can sometimes clog up a little bit more than irrigation from tap water or even water tanks. So in terms of use in the garden, it's pretty important that grey water, because it has that biological element in it, isn't like played with by kids. It's not put on food plants, like particularly, you know, you wouldn't use it in your veggie patch. You may use it to irrigate an orchard or some fruit trees where the water is not directly going onto what you're eating. But the other thing to consider is that grey water can be a little bit alkaline and salty. So you may need to experiment a little bit with where you're putting the grey water and which plants you're putting grey water on. And also an annual application of gypsum can be really good, and gypsum will help to counteract any effects of salt or any pH changes to your soil as a result of grey water. The other thing I would note, and it's in the diagram on the left, but it's very small to see, is that you need a diverter valve. So if you're setting up your own grey water system, it is really important to be able to turn it off when you want. This is important for two reasons. So you would have when I say turn it off, you'd be diverting the water into the usual sewerage rather than have it going out onto the garden. The reason this is important is because if your garden is very wet and your soil is really saturated from you've had a lot of rain, you probably don't want to make your soil totally waterlogged by adding water every single day. And the second reason is that you might want every now and again, like, to take a break. So in winter, you may turn your grey water system off if you don't need water in the garden. But if, for example, you know, you've used a lot of water for whatever reason and your plants are looking a bit worse for wear, you might want to turn that water off and use another form of irrigation for a couple of weeks just to flush any salts or anything like that down into the soil and away from your plant roots. So that leads us on really nicely to going outside and talking about our gardens. And I'm going to just stop talking about water directly for a little while and talk a little bit about summer cooling and how you can use plants and trees to help cool your home. And then we'll circle back and talk about water-wise landscapes and ways to control and manage water in your landscape. So using in terms of summer cooling and shading your house, you can have fixed elements like eaves and awnings, external blinds and things like that. Or you can have natural elements, which would be trees and vines and shrubs, or you can use the two together. So you might have a pergola with a deciduous vine growing over it, or a screening trellis that you also grow something up and over. And in Melbourne, we would usually use deciduous plants for this. And the reason for that is that we don't necessarily want cooling all year round. And we do want some heat and sun in winter. So we're usually using deciduous vines and deciduous trees. So this is just an example of where a deciduous grapevine grown over a pergola, this might be on the north or west side of your house. And the idea is that it's going to provide beautiful shade during summer. The area under it is going to be not only shady, but a little bit more humid. And that's going to have a cooling effect for your house. And then in autumn, the vine is going to lose its leaves and you're going to get lovely autumn sunshine like we had today in onto your windows, and can be used to heat, for example, if you've got a thermal slab or something like that indoors. So you can do this with pergolas and screens and vines. The other thing you can do is use deciduous trees. And the idea is to plant a deciduous tree a distance from your house, again, usually on the north side, where it will provide shade for you in summer and shadow, but in winter, it'll lose its leaves and let sunshine through. If you're using an evergreen tree, you can actually do that, and with the angle of the sun in summer and winter, you can sort of get it so that on the west side of your house, you can get a little bit more winter sun and summer shade. But as I said, we do usually use deciduous trees for shading and cooling. Now, moving on to water-saving garden design. So we can look at a whole heap of things here. I guess you immediately start thinking about plants and using native and Indigenous plants. But there are some other things that we can do as well to both save water, save the amount of water we need to have a really lovely garden, but also to allow water to flow into our landscapes and to percolate down into the soil rather than running off into the stormwater. So we've firstly talked just really briefly about plant selection. And I guess the obvious thing to look at is Indigenous plants, and most councils will have lists of Indigenous plants that are suitable to plant. If you're not so into Indigenous plants, though, you can look at plants from other dry areas in the world. So notably, South Africa has a lot of the plants that we grow that we would consider really tough and drought tolerant, and are also suitable for low water use gardens. So the sort of plants that we're looking at are ones with thin, strappy leaves that don't transpire a lot. Plants with grey and silver leaves, and the reason these are used is that they tend to reflect a lot of light, and they also often have hairy leaves that will capture just a little bit of the water that's transpired, and what that does is reduce the water use and the amount of water that is flowing through the plant. As I said, we'd look at Indigenous plants, and you can also look at cacti and succulents as really drought-tolerant plants. What I would say is, in terms of sustainability, you don't need to have an entire garden full of low water use plants. It's also a really sustainable thing to be growing food in your landscape. So what we talk about there is zoning your plants. So vegetables obviously use a lot more water than drought tolerant plants, and fruit trees also use a lot more water than many native trees. So what you would be looking to do would be to have one part of your garden which is high water use, and put all of the plants that are high water use there. And ideally, you'll put that part of the garden near where you have your water tank. And then you might have other zones of your garden which don't require any irrigation at all, or perhaps just require irrigation a little bit over summer. So the idea called hydrozoning is that that way you're not wasting water by watering, having to water like really water intensive plants next to something that doesn't actually need it. We can also look at how we set out garden beds and our general garden design and layout. And the principle here is to capture water and stop it from running off. This will also help stop erosion, but it's a bit of a principle. It's used a lot in Indigenous agricultural systems. It's also a permaculture principle, and it's essentially talking about working with the natural contours of your land and positioning your garden beds along the contours, not running down a hill. Now, I know in Melbourne, most of us have, like a lot of us have flat blocks or just blocks with very gentle slopes. But even if you do have a very, very gentle gradient to your land, this can make a difference in terms of just retaining water on site. And it's definitely worth considering in terms of the layout of your garden beds and things like that. We should also all think about soil and mulch when we're thinking about water-wise gardening. The reason is that we want to have soil that will soak up and hold water without becoming waterlogged. So the kind of golden rule is to add organic matter in the form of compost if you can. And compost will, over time, when applied to almost any soil, whether a clay soil or a sandy soil, increase the water holding capacity of the soil, as well as improving its overall health. So you can see there, the photos are sort of a step-by-step of building a raised garden bed or a no-dig garden bed, where someone's like covered the whole area in cardboard and then added heaps of organic matter on top in terms of compost, some grass clippings and wood chips and things. And then the final step is to put mulch on top. Whether you're doing that or just improving the soil on your site, mulch is really important. So mulch will keep moisture in the soil and mean that you need to water less often. And it's a good idea to use an organic mulch. So you can use for ornamental gardens like a wood chip or something like that. For veggie patches, we recommend more something that will break down faster, so lucerne or pea straw or something. If you are about to do a renovation and you're looking to protect your soil while you do it, it's a great idea to plant something into your soil rather than leaving it bare. Leaving your soil bare is going to essentially dry it out and has the risk of killing a lot of the kind of microbial activity that happens in there once the soil becomes really, really dry and degraded. So if you are renovating or even if just planning your garden, it's a great idea to plant like a green manure crop or a cover crop. So that might be a crop, you can buy them, they're called green manure crops. They would be like radish or some legumes, broad beans, something like that. And the idea is that they're seeds that are fairly inexpensive, you scatter them and rake them in, let them grow, and then before they flower, you can chop them down and just leave them as a mulch on your soil. And that's far preferable than leaving your soil really bare and exposed. So that's just one thing to think about while you are actually renovating, not to try not to leave your soil bare if possible. You might also want to think about including water features, ponds or bird baths in your garden design. You can do this sort of formally, or there are a couple of examples there of just informal, using a natural rock or an old bathtub or something. This is a really good idea just in terms of encouraging biodiversity in your garden. They can be really good features, and they are good also for cooling. If you have enough of them around your garden, they will have a cooling effect, particularly if you have them near your house. The other thing to think about in terms of landscape design is thinking about your surfaces. So if you remember that very first slide I showed about all the hard surfaces in our cities and the fact that water just runs off them and directly into stormwater, if we can have surfaces that are permeable or partly permeable, that gives water an opportunity to percolate down into the soil on your property. It stops that immediate runoff. And even if some water runs off, a permeable surface will slow down the runoff. And that's a good thing in terms of protecting our waterways. So you can see some examples there. it would be putting pavers in, but putting sand in between them or planting them with plants rather than mortar. Using a gravel, using small stepping stones, perhaps with gravel around them. Any of those things are considered impermeable surfaces. And you can also get permeable asphalts and concrete. So you can see there that if water goes on them, they're a much more open structure than a traditional concrete. And so they have cavities within them that allows water to flow through, but you get the look of a hard surface and you get the practicality of a hard surface in terms of something to park on, or an outdoor entertaining area or something like that. The other things you can consider in terms of using water really wisely are wicking beds, rain gardens, or what's called level spreaders. I'm going to focus mostly on the first two. So a wicking bed is a raised garden bed that has a water reservoir at the bottom, and instead of watering from the top, which can be quite inefficient because you get a lot of that water just evaporating straight off the soil, you would essentially put water into the water reservoir through with that pipe that's sticking up there. And then the water is absorbed from the bottom. And that means that it's absorbed much more efficiently because it reduces evaporation a lot. Plants can still take up the water. And if you have a few of these beds, you actually have the capacity to store a reasonable amount of water in your landscape. So for example, if you have a rainwater tank, as I said, use that rainwater, you might use it to be filling up the cavities in your at the bottom of your wicking beds, and that gives you a little bit of extra water storage. The next one is rain gardens, and rain gardens are sort of a similar principle, but they're using water directly from a downpipe. So they're taking water from your roof, it comes down the downpipe, and instead of going directly into the storm water, they are distributing water through a garden bed with a specialist sort of substrate in it, and then into the stormwater. And the idea is that the plants will use some of the water, so not all of that water is going directly to stormwater, but also the water will be slowed down so that it means that water goes into stormwater a lot more evenly and slowly. And secondly, it's going to filter the water. So any pollutants are hopefully going to be filtered out by the sandy substrate that you use. I'd have to say Melbourne Water has really, really good resources on rain gardens, including some great lists of plants. You can't use any plant necessarily in a rain garden because you need a plant that can withstand both drought and inundation. But Melbourne Water's done quite a lot of research, and they have a really good resources and plant lists for doing that. And I think they also have instructions on how to make your own rain gardens. So here's one example of a rain garden in action. I'm not sure why they always tend to be long and thin, but I like this one because you can see the water's going to come down from the downpipe. It's going to go into that central section filled with pebbles, and that's going to distribute the water fairly evenly into the garden bed. And then I think that one is being used to grow herbs and tomatoes and things, which is an option. The water is, relatively clean. So you can do that. And then there would be an outlet pipe as well as an overflow pipe that both usually go into storm water. So this is these are examples of what we call level spreaders. And level spreader is something that is a bit less formal in the landscape. It's not usually a structure, but what it's doing is, again, taking rainwater, sometimes from a downpipe, and spreading it out over your garden. And then often you'll have, if it's on a slope, at the bottom of the slope, you might have a French drain or some ag pipe or something that does connect to your stormwater. So you're not flooding your garden all the time, but you're using contours and swales and things to, as it says, break down and slow down outflows of rain onto your property. So the example here is sort of an example of a swale. A swale would be something where you dig a bit of a ditch to capture water, and you usually would dig it in, I think you can sort of see in the middle there, like a half moon sort of shape. And then often you'll fill up that ditch with some really coarse material, like a bit of wood chip or something like that. So water can go in there, and fill up, but at the same time you have some organic matter, so it's not a big ditch you're going to fall into. And then on the opposite side, on the downhill side of the ditch, the soil you've taken out, you use to make a mound, and that's where you would plant into. And the idea is that because the swale or the ditch will have water in it a reasonable amount of time, the plants will be able to grow their roots down and access that water, but they will be up on a raised mound to make sure that they're not going to get waterlogged. So that's the idea of a swale. I think I have an example of a French drain here as well. Oh, and a spoon drain. So a French drain would be something to use if you do have waterlogging problems on your property, or if after heavy rain, you're wanting to store some water sort of informally in your landscape. And what they are is just an informal drain, which is open at the top. So you dig a little ditch. You may put some geotextile in it, but you don't necessarily have to. You would put some ag pipe in the bottom. And then you fill that up all with gravel. And essentially what you're creating is a bit of a water reservoir where rainwater can flow in, and then it can sit there and just, as with the rain garden, really slowly percolate down into the ag drain and then perhaps into stormwater. But some of it will not. Some of it will go into the landscape and will evaporate off. So you're storing and diverting a bit of water rather than it just going into stormwater. And you can use French drains, as I said, if you've got waterlogging problems, you can dig a few and they can make a really big difference to problem garden beds and things like that. And they're relatively inexpensive kind of DIY option. The other option there is spoon drains, and that's the example on the bottom right, which is just an open drain, and one that may be ephemeral, so it may be dry quite a lot of the time, but when it rains, it captures some water. And again, the idea of it being an open drain is that some of that water will evaporate off, and not all of it will go, or it can sit there being, like a little pond for a couple of days. Not all of it will go directly into the storm water. Okay, so we've got lots of time for questions, which is good. I'm going to talk just very quickly about Firewise gardening, which is part of this module. As I said, it's possibly not super relevant to us in, Stonnington and Glen Eira, but it is very relevant if you have a holiday home or if you're thinking of, a bit of a tree change. So the idea of greening in a Firewise garden is to be careful of your materials, and be careful of planting very close to the house, but also to use plants that are, I guess, more fire retardant rather than flammable near your home. So the CFA in Melbourne has quite a good resource. Sorry, Doug, I didn't point you to this, but I think I've put it in the resources at the end, on the slide at the end. So it has some good guides that came out of the Black Saturday fires, and they talk about things like using non-flammable materials for pathways rather than using wood chip or something. You'd be using recycled brick or gravel. You'd be spacing out your plants more so that you're not creating, pathways for the fire to follow in an ember attack. and you'd be using those fire retardant plants. The other element that's really important in Firewise gardening is maintenance. So there's no point having, you can see there's no leaf litter on the ground. I imagine their gutters are sparklingly clean and things like that. And also to keep your garden hydrated. So again, if you've got stormwater, if you have a rainwater tank, don't be afraid to use it, and keep the soil around your house hydrated. So this is just an example of one of the Black Saturday fires that where the house was saved, and you can see there a very lush looking mulberry tree, and mulberry trees are great at accessing whatever water is available in the environment. They have extensive root systems, so they're usually really lush and green, and that mulberry tree was really kind of credited with helping to save that house. Some of the plants that came out on plant lists following the Black Saturday fires were kind of surprising. I think camellias rated really, really highly because they store a lot of water in their leaves. And there were a few other exotic plants that did well. But you can see in that photo also the idea of having, quite a large cleared area, clear of large eucalypt trees around your house is what's recommended. And something that people, I think, struggle a little bit if you've made the decision to go and live in a heavily wooded or forested area, to then look at clearing around your property. But the evidence from the Black Saturday fires is certainly that was beneficial and what saved several homes. So that's about the end of my presentation. I've got some resources there, and I know Doug's put other links and things up as we go. So there's the CFA Landscaping for Bushfire link. I've kept the Sustainable House Day link in, even though that was last weekend, because I noticed there are still quite a lot of resources available on the Renew website, and there are still some information things going on, but it's worth having a look at those houses. Even if you didn't get to go through them in person, you can see the houses that were featured in Sustainable House Day. So there are also the links for, Tankulator and looking at your wells, water efficient appliances, and your water audit tools. Okay, so I'm happy to take any questions. Remy, have you got any?
Thank you. That picture of the mulberry tree is so powerful. And also I've learned a new word, swale. So really great. So folks, if you do have questions for Charlotte, it can be specific to your house or it can be general. Please put it in the Q&A. She's got a lot of experience and this is your opportunity to get some really great tidbits out of her. I'll start with a question from Jennifer. So can you recommend any current irrigation systems for urban gardens and explain the benefits of different systems? Is there a resource that reviews them?
That's a great question. That's a fantastic question. There is no single website or anything that reviews them really well that I'm aware of, particularly ones that are relevant to Australian conditions. Generally speaking, drip irrigation is the most water efficient form of irrigation. So it directs water deeply to plant roots with minimal evaporation. So compared to hand watering or watering with a sprinkler or even the risers that are used in irrigation systems, drip irrigation is by far the most water efficient. There's a little bit of a trend back to using spray irrigation, and they're those little black pipes that you see coming up with small sprays on them. Part of that is to do with pest management, because what we were finding in gardens with a lot of drip irrigation is that things like spider mites that really like a dry environment as opposed to a humid environment were breeding and are becoming a real problem. They are a huge problem in Melbourne. Not so much, I would say, on Indigenous plants. So that's a clue as to the direction to go. But yeah, drip irrigation is the way to go. And perhaps with some spray irrigation, if you have particular plants that are susceptible to those pests, or sometimes they're put in for veggie gardens with the idea that you're going to dig up your drip irrigation, or you're going to put in a spade through it all the time. But you can design drip irrigation systems for veggie gardens that you can just lift up, and then you can dig over and do all your planting and then put that part of the irrigation system back down. So again, they are considered the more efficient ones. So I hope that answers that question. I don't have a great resource. I wish I did.
That's great. I often think we need like a, compare the market for like every product that's out there. So I've actually got a question in the chat, so don't worry about putting it in the Q&A, Marilyn, though if people have others, please do put it in the Q&A. I have a bird bath, but discovered mosquito larvae in it. I emptied it. How long do the larvae take to grow again? And maybe expanding that, just advice to keep your kind of, water features clean and so you can have them for a long time, I guess, and effective.
Yeah, that's a good question too. And if you're having your bird baths and things with the idea of attracting wildlife, then having that water clean is really important. So for bird baths, there's no secret to them to keeping them clean that I'm aware of, other than regularly like flushing out the water. Put them somewhere, like I've got one right next to my tap, the tap that I use every day. That's a great place for it because I can see when it needs cleaning out, things like that. And I've usually, got the hose on, so it's no problem just to give it a quick clean out and fill up at that time. So I think putting them in places that are convenient is really good. Copper bird baths can help to, like, they can stay clean a bit longer. They seem to have a bit of an antibacterial kind of effect, but they are very expensive. So a copper one might be the way to go. In terms of the mosquito larvae, if you've already tipped them out, I think they're probably going to be dead. But you'd want to give your bird bath a scrub before you fill it up again, just to make sure that there's no kind of residual bits and pieces in there.
Awesome, thank you. So I have a question. So if you have obviously, cost of living, etc., are there a few things that obviously everyone has their own nuances of their property, but in your view, are there things amongst what you've talked about tonight that is kind of best bang for buck, like at a minimum, if I could get you to do anything, this is what I'd get you to do?
Well, obviously doing a water audit of your home makes you more aware of your water use, and that's zero cost and potentially going to save you on your water bills. It's not necessarily going to divert any water, away from stormwater. What I would say is, like, there are secondhand tanks available, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a big investment. But the other thing is, I think sometimes that idea, if we look at like one huge tank and the cost is just enormous for what we want, there's nothing to stop you starting small. So you can get those olive containers off eBay really quickly, or Gumtree or whatever, and they may be either free or $20 or something. You can hook that up to a downpipe and have a small water storage thing. It's only a couple of 100 litres. I've seen people hook 3 or 4 of those up and, increase the water storage. Again, really, really low cost. But I really think anything you can do. So the form of grey water that I didn't talk about, which is a really simple one to use, is just to be, when you're rinsing your veggies and things like that, just have a bowl of water in the sink, rinse your veggies in there, and then take that water outside and put it on your garden. And that's grey water use. And again, it's a zero cost approach. For landscaping and garden design, plants are always cheap and economical compared to hard landscaping. So if you can, grow a tree, it might cost you a couple of $100. It might have the cooling effect of a bit of insulation, or probably, it'll help you keep your air conditioner off for an hour a day in summer or something like that. So in the kind of gardening side of things, plants are always considered to be a really economical choice. Yeah, and compared to hard landscaping or, building retaining walls, any of those sort of things.
Yeah. Yes, in this series of webinars, trees have gotten a lot of plugs. They're good for many, many things. Beck, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. It was a great presentation. I just had a question around whether you have preferences or recommendations around preferred material for tanks, because there's like polyurethane, maybe not polyurethane. There's like a plastic type, and there's metal, and then there's the kind of bladder type that you showed as well.
Yeah, there are heaps of different choices. I think that it depends. Everyone who's selling a tank will say that their material is best. People, when the bladder ones came out, I think it was around, maybe about 12 years ago, maybe a little longer. And everyone was really worried that they were going to be leaky, because you just assume from looking at them that they look like they're going to be, susceptible. But where they're positioned under a house, there's almost nothing that can damage them. So I haven't heard a lot of examples of them leaking, or any actually. The one thing I would say with them, because they tend to be down low on a property, the water pressure coming from them can be really low. So you may need to purchase a pump to use those bladder tanks. Whereas if you've got a slimline tank or something, especially if you've made it a little bit elevated, if you can get away with gravity feeding for most hand watering. If you're using a dripper system, you probably do need to have a pump. But in terms of materials, it really depends what you're after. Like, the corrugated iron ones can heat up a bit, and everyone loves that Monument Grey, which absorbs lots of heat. But because you've got a large volume of water in there, the water that comes out is not often, like it doesn't heat up to the point where, it's hot water coming out of there. So yeah, it's really up to you and cost and the look you're after.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Charlotte. I've got a couple more questions for you. Just folks, if you do have anything specific to your own renovation, feel free to pop it in the Q&A function. I think this is going to be similar as what I asked you about the best bang for buck, but if you're in an apartment, obviously that you can renovate an apartment, it's much more restricted, but what would be your advice around how you can say, if you don't actually have a garden to pour that water into, what can you do?
That's a good question. You're probably looking at reducing the amount of water you use rather than trying to store it. So you would be looking at, low flow taps and shower heads and appliances, I think, and also sort of your habits. You have to have really short showers.
Totally. Awesome. And I'd love to hear about what you've done at your home. We started off by saying that, you're a keen renovator. What are the bits that you've implemented in your home? And I'd be keen to know as well if that starts conversation with people that see it and maybe inspires them. I'd love to, just hear a bit about what you found. What's really worked for you.
Yeah, I'll give you a little rundown. So we made a deliberate choice to choose sort of a builder that was very focused on sustainability. And that worked in most cases. But we still found there were a few things where, you know, we didn't see eye to eye. So basically what we did, we've got a Californian bungalow. It does, the back of it faces north. So we opened up the north side of it so that, you know, we got natural sun in. And we've got a passive solar design, which is working fantastically. So the passive solar design is essentially a polished concrete slab in the living area with double glazed windows that seal really, really well. And we've found that as well as a lot of insulation around walls and ceilings and things. We found that on a hot day, it's about 10 degrees cooler inside. So we don't have any air conditioning. We just have a couple of pedestal fans that we use to move air around. But we haven't we've lived here 2 years, so we haven't had a super, super hot summer yet with, you know, 40-degree days. But we haven't felt that we need to have air conditioning at all. And in terms of winter, we get the passive solar means that we get direct sun onto that concrete slab floor for the whole of winter. Sometimes, like today, it can actually be a little bit too warm inside, because if, you know, we're kind of designed for winter temperatures now, but we had, you know, almost summery temperatures today. So it's sort of opening windows up and things like that. But in the middle of winter, we do need, we have electric heat pump heating, and we do turn it on for a few hours each day. So the solar passive doesn't mean we don't need heating, but certainly it's, you know, reduced our reliance on that. In terms of water use, we've got a really, other than a big veggie patch, we've got a pretty low water use garden. We've taken the decision, because we've got a large garden, to have like 3 different sites for water tanks. So we've got one near our garden shed, and that is just a really small water tank, but the one we use all the time, because we've got chickens, so all their water needs, like that coop is up the back of our property. It's really handy. It's great for like washing out, you know, garden tools and all that sort of stuff near the shed. And then we've got another one down the side of our house, which is larger. We do have our grey water design plumbed in, but we haven't connected it yet. And that's where we did run into a bit of problems. When I said make sure everyone is on board and there's a plan, we got to D-Day with, like, you know, the bathroom plumbing's going in. And the plumber sort of said, oh, nah, I'll just like hook everything up. And so we had a bit of a, you know, a couple of uncomfortable weeks with discussions with the builder and plumber to say, no, this was in the original brief and we actually want it. And there was a bit of a feeling, I think, of like, well, we're not in drought now, you know, so why would you want that? Whereas we're very much designing it for the future, and we know the time will come when we're desperate for water in the garden. So we had to push back a bit on that. So yeah, that's a bit of a potted history. People are really welcome to ask anything they want.
That's so interesting. Sorry, just picking up on that, what you said about the plumber and the builder and sort of being like, oh, we're not in drought right now. That was something that came up in the last week's webinar, which was about sustainable building materials, is dealing with some pushback from, I guess, you know, tradespeople who aren't used to this yet. We think it'll become more normal, but at the moment, there's possibly some who are really good at it and some who are less so. Yeah, so I think what you've kind of said, make sure people are all on board early, but is there any tips for making sure that you don't get that kind of pushback from people, particularly if you're passionate about the area but you don't technically know a lot about how to do it?
It can be really difficult because you're sort of in the builder's hands from some point of view, or the architect's hands in terms of taking their advice about sustainable materials. Interestingly, we did our first renovation as owner builders, and we did have a lot more control there. Guess not only in terms of selecting things, but also selecting tradespeople who we knew were going to, you could talk through the whole job with them. Whereas with with a builder, they're an intermediary. And so you very rarely get to speak directly to the tradesperson who's doing it. So you sort of have a double job of convincing the builder and then convincing the tradie as well.
Yeah.
And that was really the reason we deliberately chose a builder with really good sustainability credentials, because we knew at least they would be on board. But yeah, I guess it depends what you've got in your contract, like how detailed your contract is, and how much research you can do in terms of specifying exactly what you want. It's really hard to be across everything. Like we, have no idea for lighting, for example, what we need, what's low energy use, what's not. Like we knew, yes, go for LEDs, but we did get a third person to help us. We got a lighting consultant and he was totally over everything. He's like, oh yeah, you don't want so many, you don't need this many lights. We're going to cut that number in half and use, this product instead of that one. So yeah, if you can get some expert advice that your builder is also on board with, like we sort of said to our builder, we think there's something that we can improve with the lighting. Can you recommend someone to us? Yeah, so, and I can see Doug's putting a whole heap of, guides for like green plumbers and stuff in the chat, which, yeah, you might need to do a bit of your own research.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that, like, that's exactly why, well, what we hope with this webinar series, that people feel like they can access good information, that it's out there. And I really recommend to anyone joining us, Renew has just so much to offer in terms of resources in this space. So you don't need to start from a scratch with just a fresh Google. At the moment, we don't have any more questions. So I'll just give the audience one more minute. If you've got a question, pop it in the Q&A. Otherwise, we can have an early mark.
Yeah, while we are waiting, I would say actually the other area that we got heaps of ideas from and things was Renew and taking part in Sustainable House Day. We were probably really lucky in some ways that when we were looking at or planning our renovation, it was during the COVID lockdown. So all of the Sustainable House Day houses were online. So you could go to like 20 houses in one day. But that did give us some great ideas, and hearing people speak about the building process and journey and what they did and who they used and the issues that they came across. Certainly that's all really good to know, and good particularly to hear about how people did solve those problems when they came up, because I think it's really rare to have a build where there aren't some points of tension. So it's good to just learn from other people's experiences about how they negotiated their way through those.
Amazing. I found myself feeling nostalgic for a lockdown just then, and then I was like, oh no. But Beck did say all from the comfort of your couch. So there was some upsides. Marilyn asks, and this is one for you, Doug, when will Sustainable House Day be happening again? Marilyn, bad news, just missed it for this year. Though, as Charlotte said, I think there's still a lot of resources online. But Doug, is there a place where attendees can sign up, maybe a Renew list where they can sign up and they'll be alerted before Sustainable House Day next year?
Yeah, definitely. You can go to sustainablehouseday.com, or you can go to renew.org.au and just sign up for the mailing list, and you'll get plenty of notice for that.
Yeah,
There's
awesome.
there's also extension sessions that are still happening over the next month or so, and I'll put a link in the chat as well for the YouTube channel's playlist of all the house tours from this year. So there's plenty of stuff there people can enjoy. And it's all free.
Right. That's awesome. And it'll also be in the City of Glen Eira's newsletters, and I imagine the City of Stonnington one as well. We've got another question. I am making them live. I don't know if that means you're able to see them, just because this one's got a few technicalities in it. I use a Holman automated watering system with soaker hoses when away traveling, otherwise hand watering. The app always mentions litres per hour. What is an adequate amount for veggie beds versus drought tolerant perennials?
Oh, that's putting me on the spot. Per hour. It depends a bit on your soil, because it's hard to generalize in terms of litres per hour. But what you can think about, or you can even test yourself, is to get a 9-litre watering can. So it's a standard watering can, fill it up and then water a plant to how you think it should be watered. But also use a little trowel to dig in the soil and just make sure you've got a reasonable depth of water going in from that watering can just on one plant or one little patch of soil. And you'll probably find, I don't know, it depends on your soil, you might find that's between like 4 to 6 litres or something like that, or 3 to 5 litres. But if you can work out how much water you need in one little spot, so that's the equivalent of one dripper outlet, then that will give you'll be able to calculate, like work backwards and calculate it. So say you're doing 8 litres an hour and you find 4 litres is the perfect amount for your soil, then you'd leave your dripper system on for half an hour. I hope that makes sense, but yeah, so a little bit of trial and error, and you can do it that way. But generally, if you've got a dripper in summer, you're putting them on for a reasonably long period of time. So like half an hour, 40 minutes, something like that, in hot weather, rather than doing little bursts of 10 minutes. Because if you do that, you can do it while you're home, actually, put the dripper on and then do a dig around. And you want the water to be penetrating sort of 15 to 20 centimetres down into your soil. So if you're doing it for 10 minutes, I would estimate that you're probably only getting a few centimetres down in the soil. But you might have really, really free draining, fabulously water retentive soil, and you may need a lesser time. But yeah, I would experiment while you're home and do that watering can trick, and that should give you a bit of a guide as to how long you want to put your dripper system on. And in terms of, I think there was a question, was it Indigenous plants and something that needed more water?
Yeah, it said veggie bed versus drought tolerant perennials. Don't think you need to give specific litres per hour, but I mean, you did mention obviously you need a lot more water in a veggie bed.
Yeah, so actually probably the length of time would be the same, because you want the same water penetration, but you would do, for example, the veggies maybe 3 times a week or something like that, or every second day. Or in summer, it might be every day, whereas the water-wise perennials, you might only water them once or twice a week, but the same amount of time, so that you're wanting a really good amount of water to get down into the soil each time you water.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Sorry, my dog was doing a little bark. Sorry for anyone who heard that. Hope that helped, Caroline. Okay, well, I think that we're done. So I think I'll start wrapping up, and if I get any very last minute questions, I will bring them forward, because we do have a little bit of time. But otherwise, we can give people an extra 10 minutes with their families. So thank you everyone for attending today. And a big thank you to Charlotte. We've really appreciated your insights. When, it can be really hard to find good information on this stuff. So really appreciate it. And thank you to Renew for working with the City of Stonnington and City of Glen Eira on this. A few final things. When you exit this webinar, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey. We ask it that you can do it. It helps us to improve our webinars going forward. And I also wanted to mention this is the last webinar in our sustainable building and renovating series. However, we do have another webinar coming up with Renew, which is called Winter Comfort for Renters. So that's happening on the 23rd of May. We'll put a prompt to that in our follow-up email, but please do register for that. That'll be a really great event as well. Also in the chat is a great link from Beck to the My Smart Garden program, which has a lot of sort of overlapping resources with what Charlotte was talking about, and there's a lot, like so much in-person workshops for whatever your specific needs are in your own garden. So yeah, recommend you have a look at that. And I think that's it. So go ahead and enjoy your evenings. Thanks, everyone.